How's everybody doing today? All right. Still a lot of energy. That's good. What I want to do today is to talk a little bit about the interface between a particular assessment tool, 1010, which is really designed to try to understand the issues that come up when you're really understanding what teams are doing, the people behind the process, and how that relates to how it is that we can both, after diagnosing the kinds of problems you might see, how it is that you might go about fixing those kinds of problems. To give you an example of why it is that we need to think about the human component of things, because of course each of us spends a tremendous amount of time worrying about the technical details of the work that we do. Imagine, and this is a real example, that someone is trying to design a plant that really has to deal with highly corrosive materials. The traditional way of doing that would involve a lot of safety measures. And what if, right, and what happened in this particular case was that the designer came up with a design that was going to allow the use of plastic piping that wouldn't interact with the corrosive, and brought this design forward to the company. And this design would be done faster, it would be significantly less expensive, but it had never been done before. And it turns out that the team got together and deliberated for several months, talked about it, and ultimately opted against the design, not because they didn't think it was going to work, but because it just hadn't been done before, and there was some just trepidation with doing something brand new. You know, at the end of the day, when those kinds of things happen, they are not technical problems, because all of the technical work pointed to this being a faster, cheaper, and better solution. These are people problems. The people couldn't get over the fact that they were going to have to do something new, and that ultimately led to the selection of a design that was going to take longer to complete and be significantly more expensive. So, at the end of the day, what we need to do, and what I'm going to do in the talk today, is to talk about the role of the people who are part of any kind of construction project. And if we're going to worry about those people, what we need to do is to worry both about how it is that we can measure the successes and failures of the individuals, groups, and cultures that come together when in any kind of a project. But once you've identified those problems, you also need a process for dealing with the issues that come up. And that means thinking about the kinds of expertise you need to have on board in order to be able to understand the information that you're getting and figure out what to do with it next. So just to give an example of what I mean here, in large-scale construction projects, everything becomes about process. And so if you look at what you've got documents that talk about the design of the project, that figure out what the responsibilities of various subcontractors are going to be. These processes lay out the materials that are needed. They lay out the people who should be deployed at different times. They lay out the relative ordering of things. And so the entire project is governed by a set of processes. And those processes are thought to be extraordinarily important in the overall success of the project. Now, the fundamental problem with focusing exclusively on these processes is that underlying all of these processes are a whole bunch of people who are doing jobs. And when things go wrong, they rarely go wrong because the process itself wasn't followed. They go wrong because that process was put in place to deal with some problem that came up in the past. The thing about processes is that processes are, generally speaking, backward-looking. They are designed to solve yesterday's problems, whereas what we really want to be able to do in order to manage a project successfully is actually to be able to solve the next generation of problems. So if you think about any kind of a standard sort of construction project diagram that lists we focus on the processes that need to be carried out, on the ordering of those processes, on which of those processes depend on others. And what's missing from that is the connection of each of those elements to the underlying organizational chart. How is it that the people play a role in making sure that these projects go off appropriately? Now, my background, I'm a cognitive psychologist. I study the way people think. I spend a lot of time talking to people outside of my discipline because, as I've discovered, almost everybody I know has a mind, and almost nobody knows how that mind works. Turns out if you understood a little bit more about the way your mind works, you might do things a little bit differently. And I run a program at the University of Texas, and this is a program that we've partnered a bit with CII. My program is called the Human Dimensions of Organizations, and the aim of our program is to teach people in business and government and nonprofits and the military about people. Because we staff our projects, we staff our organizations with people who have tremendous amounts of technical expertise, and we don't put enough people in place who also understand the individuals, groups, and cultures that play a role in the success of our projects. So how are we going to do this? What CII has developed is a great tool called 1010, and we're going to be doing a couple of sessions, and I'll give you more information about those at the end. We're going to do a couple of sessions introducing more detail about this tool, but the idea behind the 1010 questionnaire is that it gives lots of people within a project the opportunity to assess a variety of aspects of the way that people are operating in that project. The question is, to what degree do people trust each other? To what degree do people feel like there is effective communication? To what degree do people have the information that they need? How well are people working together as a team, both within an organization and across the many organizations that come together to create a large project? To what extent do people feel like their role is clear and like the evaluation that they're getting of their role is clear? Now, the thing about this kind of evaluation, it's done anonymously and it's done by large numbers of people who play a role in the project, because typically when you try to evaluate how things are going, you go to the project manager and the project manager says everything is great, because it looks great at that moment. A, because you need to believe that to get through the day, and partly because from your level, things may be moving ahead on schedule. We have lots of benchmarks for the success of projects, but those benchmarks are largely focused on metrics that don't really measure directly how well people are working together. And so if the project looks like it's running along more or less on schedule, more or less on budget, everything seems fine, even if there are things going on under the surface that may threaten to derail the project. So what the 1010 program does is it allows you to take people information and put it on a par with all of the rest of the benchmarks that you have. Because one of the things we know about human psychology is once I give you a number, that number takes on a particular reality. And so if you have schedule information, if you have cost information, if you have number of personnel information, those numbers become a central part of the decision-making process, and issues about how well people are working together, how clear people are on their roles, that information begins to fall by the wayside because you don't have numbers around it. And on top of that, you don't have expertise in the room to be thinking about those kinds of problems. In fact, if you look around at many of the kinds of projects that you work on, you will find that you are in rooms full of people who went into the profession they went into because they didn't want to have to deal with all these people. And so this is not a comfortable conversation for them to be having. And so by creating measures that help to identify these problems, we are re-injecting knowledge and understanding about the people and the issues back into the equation. Now, the 10-10 program is valuable because it identifies potential problems, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what to do with that information later. And a lot of what we're going to be doing in our implementation session, later this afternoon, is to really think not just what is this tool, what can I get out of it, but once I've got this information, what can I do with it? Because you have all of this expertise in engineering, in design, in construction, in project management, but not necessarily expertise in the way that people work. And so one of the big lessons here is that it is important to cultivate additional expertise in the way that people operate, both by adding additional training to the great people that you have on board already, as well as considering additional people who have more knowledge of the way that people work to inject more of that into thinking about how to deal with issues that may be coming up that are identified by tools like 1010. And that's where this Human Dimensions of Organizations program comes in, and where we're developing some programs with CII to create tools that people can use in order to do their work more effectively. Now, to give you an example, because it's easy to say this kind of stuff, let me give you an example of some of the kinds of things that you can begin to cultivate in your organization to begin to see how to deal with problems. And I want to talk about two issues. Both are related to what we could think of as a smart approach to thinking about people. One of which is, how do we foster more effective and better, more agile thinking among the people who are working with us? Because part of the problem with having just a set of processes that people go through when they're at work is that if the situation you're in doesn't really match the process all that well, what do? How do we train people to think a little bit better on their feet? It turns out that the field of cognitive psychology has a tremendous amount of knowledge about how to think more effectively. And this really focuses on three things: developing more effective habits, using those habits to maximize the quality of your knowledge, and then finding strategies to use that knowledge when you need it. Now, the habit piece of this is extraordinarily important because good work really requires good habits. And we spend a tremendous amount of time thinking about safety, right? We often like to open meetings by thinking a little bit about a safety issue because we want that to be a habit. But those habits need to extend beyond just creating a safe work environment to also creating a work environment in which people are knowledgeable about what's going on in the organization, which means it's extraordinarily important to ask the question why a lot. Because the question why elicits what psychologists call causal knowledge. Causal knowledge is the stuff you use to understand how things work. And the more that you understand the way things work, the more that you can solve new problems rather than just following a process. In many ways, the processes we implement are just a 21st century equivalent to slapping the side of the TV set when the picture went funny, right? If it works, great. If it doesn't work, I don't know why. But if you actually understand the way the situation works, you can go beyond the process and really begin to think about why are people acting like this. Now, here's a helpful tip for the day. If we're going to start using the question why in an effective way, we have to reclaim the question why as a force for good. In lots of organizations, the question why gets used by people who really mean I disagree. They don't want to say, I disagree with you. So they say, why are we doing this? And we drag out conversations, and as a result, the question why has become a question that makes people defensive. We need to reclaim that. Asking why is important because the more we understand about the way people work, the more effectively we can solve problems later. And then we need to recognize that true smart thinking requires using the knowledge you have. That the smartest people you know are the ones who know a lot and are able to bring that knowledge to bear when they need it. So if we return to this example of the chloralkali plant that I mentioned at the very beginning, if we had people on board on that project who knew a little bit more about the way that human beings make decisions, then as the conversation began to get uncomfortable and people were worried about doing something new, there would be people in the group who would understand that there is a real bias in human thinking against doing things that are new simply because they're new, particularly as the stakes get higher. And so that would have injected a little bit more understanding of why there was an initial reluctance to pursue this idea, which might have given an opportunity to allow people to sit on that idea and really kind of make themselves more comfortable with it by at least making that idea feel more familiar for a while before sitting down to make a final decision. So it's important to have people who are part of the decision process who actually have some understanding of the way that people operate. So one element of smart thinking is really these elements of having good habits, using your knowledge, maximizing the quality of your knowledge, using that knowledge when you need it. But there's another smart approach that also plays a role in understanding people information, and that really has to do with the ability to change people's behavior. Because the thing about organizations is people get into habits. The culture of organizations promotes doing the same thing over and over and over, and that can lead to problems that a tool like 1010 can identify. But if you don't know how to change people's behavior, then nothing will change in the overall structure of a project. Because it turns out that when we try to influence other people, we often focus on the message. We often think if we could just figure out the right way to tell something to someone, that would fundamentally change their behavior. But if you think about your own behavior, it is rare that somebody has simply told you something and had that message alone have a fundamental impact on what you do on a daily basis. Instead, if you really want to change behavior of people in your organization, you have to help them to identify positive goals that focus on new actions that they can perform rather than just watching out for things they should no longer perform. That you have to create really good plans that people can engage in, where those plans will ultimately lead to a new set of habits. You have to be aware of all of the obstacles that are going to be in your way. There's been a lot of discussion at the conference about ethics. One of the things we know about ethics is that it is rare that a single person is responsible for an ethical lapse that brings down a project. Instead, while one person may do the wrong thing, if everyone else looks the other way and isn't really willing to call people out on it, if you're not creating the culture that supports ethical decisions, then you can walk down that ethical slippery slope. And that is one of the big obstacles that can come up, is that when people begin to cut corners in order to make the numbers work, you are stepping out onto a slippery slope, and it requires people who are willing to stand up and say, you know what, yes, this is going to make the project cost more money. Yes, this is going to delay things, but it's also the right and appropriate thing to do. And you have to have that plan in advance, because coming up with ways to deal with obstacles is sort of like what happens when you go to a party. If you've ever been to a party and somebody insults you at the party, and you can't think of the great witty comeback in that moment. And then as you're walking out the door, you think of the great line you should have said, but you can't go back in time and get that zinger in. Okay? Planning for obstacles is like knowing what the insult is going to be before it happens, which means now you're ready to deal with it before it happens. So if you know in advance what you're going to do when somebody wants to do something that's going to cut a corner, it's much easier to deal with that than if you wait until it happens and then you have to figure out what your response is going to be. We need to structure our environment in a way that makes the desirable behaviors for people really easy to perform and the undesirable behaviors hard. If people aren't communicating effectively with each other, then we need to create an environment in which people who need to communicate are coming into contact with each other more often, so that they end up having what appear to be water cooler conversations about critical issues that weren't happenstance. They were engineered by the way that you created the environment that people are in. And last, we need to make sure that we engage with all of the people in our projects, because fundamentally human beings are a social species, even though when you get a group of engineers together in a room at the same time, it doesn't always feel that way. But what we need to do is really to recognize that human beings are not particularly imposing creatures by ourselves. You know, I work at the University of Texas. If you take one of our great linebackers, imposing really amazing physical specimens, you put them up against a bear, and my money's on the bear every single time. Because what makes human beings so great is our ability to work together effectively. And that means that when we want to get our projects to run the right way, we need to make sure we are creating visible examples of people who are doing the right thing, and that we create good mentorship for the younger people who will learn the appropriate things to do as they go along. And if we do those things, then we put people into a situation in which they have the best possible chance of improving their behaviors, which will pull everyone together and allow us to deal with the kinds of problems that are lurking under the surface beneath the benchmarks that we spend most of our time focusing on. What does this mean to take a step back from this? What this means is that if we want our projects to run successfully, we need to recognize that people are at the core of that. Yes, it's important to have good processes in place. Yes, it's important to have technical expertise. But no number of tools, no amount of technical wizardry is going to help us to get beyond the people issues that crop up time and again. And so what we can do is to help you to measure what's going on with those people in order to put that information on a par with the information you're already using to understand how well your projects are going. And then more importantly, once you've identified things that are potential problems, we can help you to begin to think about how do we change the behavior of individuals and groups, and to create a culture that allows projects to get done on time, on budget, ethically, and appropriately. So we can help you to implement that change. And so, as with many of these plenary talks, this is a grand advertisement for an implementation session that we're running later today. We're running it at 1 o'clock and again at 2:25 in Grand Ballrooms J and K, which is just around the corner over there. And here's what you're going to get, because now I feel like the pitch man. Here's what you're going to get. The first thing is we want you to understand this 1010 tool in some amount of detail, because there's a lot of work, a lot of research that's gone into this. This is a set of questions and reporting that people do from across the organization that allows you to get a real snapshot at various points in time in a project to understand how effectively or ineffectively people are working together. Once you've got that, though, you also need some tools to think in a smarter way, to think smarter, to make smarter changes in order to be able to use that information to make changes in the future. And as if that weren't enough, everyone who comes to the session today will also get a copy of my book, Smart Thinking, which you can bring home and use to improve some of the things that you're doing at work. Thanks so much for your attention. We hope to see you at 1 or 2:25.